Hope you enjoyed our visit with the good Martin Luther this morning. Today is our last installment in the book of Job. We're going to be reading from Job chapter 42, verses 1 through 6 and 10 through 16. Then Job answered the Lord, I know that you can do all things and that no purpose of yours can be thwarted. You said, who is this that hides counsel without knowledge? Therefore I have uttered what I did not understand, things too wonderful for me, which I did not know. God, you said, hear, and I will speak. I will question you, and you declare to me. I have heard you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eyes see you. Therefore I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes. And the Lord restored the fortunes of Job when he had prayed for his friends. And the Lord gave Job twice as much as he had before. Then there came to him all his brothers and sisters, all who had known him before, and they ate bread with him in his house. They showed him sympathy and comforted him for all the evil that the Lord had brought upon him. And each of them gave him a piece of money and a gold ring. The Lord blessed the latter days of Job more than his beginning. He had 14,000 sheep, 6,000 camels, 1,000 yoke of oxen, and 1,000 donkeys. He also had 7 sons and 3 daughters. He named the first Jemiah, meaning dove, the second Keziah, meaning cinnamon, and the third Karan-Habash, meaning dark eyes. In all the land there were no women so beautiful as Job's daughters, and their father gave them an inheritance along with their brothers. After this, Job lived 140 years and saw his children and his children's children 4 generations. And Job died old and full of days. The gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. At the very start of the book, the story of Job, we learn it takes place in a mysterious, far-away land with characters we do not know. Rather, we do not know from factual history. But just like characters in a good Garrison Keillor tale on old Prairie Home Companion shows, we know them personally. We can envision these characters as very real, and we can relate to them. Maybe even visualize someone from your own experience. That first verse of Job kicked off the story, telling us Job is a sinless character, blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. That is the Job we are to come to know in this book. Job, the sinless character. With what we know of Job, the catastrophes that come upon him are for no good reason. We can even imagine the sum of his losses. We can think about and know his friends, even if we do not know them personally. His friends continue on and on with theological arguments of sin and retribution of God because of sin. This theology of their ancestors is of no help or comfort to Job. He would believe them and even be comforted by that theology and it fits his historic teaching, except he cannot accept that he has sinned. He has not only lost worldly possessions and health because he does not accept that he has sinned, he now has actually lost the very faith structure that is being challenged. What Job does discover, which is helpful to us, is that that new experience of life requires new ways of speaking, speaking of and understanding God, a radical, different, and new theology. In this Star Wars-style story, Job's suffering encompasses a wide array of human sorrows. Those we could call both ordinary and massive. They certainly capture human experience to which each of us can relate. His wide range of responses combine despair, self-pity, and outrage. Anyone who knows devastation can relate to his extended and confusing reiteration of his pain. We can also relate to the confrontation with his caring but wrong-headed friends, and of course can relate to this disruptive relationship with God. Yet across the many poetic speeches of Job himself and his Orthodox friends, Job keeps insisting on the inadequacy of our Orthodox views. He trusts his experience and knows that he has committed no sin, at least no sin sufficiently atrocious to arouse these devastating outcomes. In the midst of his terrors, he dares to tell the truth of his life. He dares to seek an audience with his Creator. Remarkably, even though his lamenting and complaining and shouting his discontent with God, who he believes has been attacking him, he keeps a relationship with God alive. In today's final reading from Job, Job utters his final words after his encounter with God. God's words described again in poetic discourse coming from the cloud, from the storm. Kathleen O'Connor, one of the commentators, would opine that some interpreters come to the belief that God encountered in a whirlwind is an overpowering bully. If this path is followed, it leads to a theology of aggressive, defined power that coerces human submission, no matter how unwillingly. Not where we would want to go, not a description of our God. Job certainly does not go there. Quite the opposite. Job utters a profound statement of faith. He starts with his history when he says, I heard of you by hearing of the ear. It is true in the past, Job, like his friends, knew the nature of God from secondary sources, by the instruction of others, from his family, from wise sages, from his faith community. But Job goes on and says, but now my eyes see you. My eyes, Job says, see you. Now Job meets God in his own life, right there in front of him. He experiences God. In the thick of the storm that has been his life, God appears as the Holy One to Job. Instead of being forced into submission, Job speaks of firsthand experience, a personal meeting, a kind of seeing that surpasses known speech about God, goes beyond the theology of his friends in the past. Job is overwhelmed, yet Job is honored. Job's life has changed. Job's theology, his understanding of God, has changed. Rarely do we readily verbalize our ignorance, or even when it comes to the mind of God. Job's broken and contrite heart, nonetheless, resonates with those of us who have known despair, loss, and dark night of the soul. The encounter in the storm calls Job to a new kind of theological knowledge, a new understanding of God. This encounter summons him beyond himself to a heightened sense of divine presence in his life and in the world. There is a freeing honesty about his raw confession. Remember, Job has hit spiritual rock bottom, a place familiar to anyone who struggles with deep sorrow, extended suffering, or acute guilt. In the depths of darkness, anger, limitations laid bare, he, as we, turns to God, pleads for mercy, and waits. This is indeed the true patience of Job. With that understanding of Job's perspective, I invite you to hear Job's reflection to God in a modern translation. Job speaking. I admit it, I was the one. I babbled on about things far beyond me, made small talk about wonders way over my head. God, you told me, listen and let me do the talking. Let me ask the questions. You give answers. Job's response is, I admit I once lived by rumors of you. Now I have all firsthand. For my own eyes and ears, I'm sorry. Forgive me. I'll never do that again. I promise. I'll never again live on crust of hearsay and crumbs of rumor. That seems like it might be a good place to end the story, end the book of Job. But the book does not stop there. We have this epilogue to deal with. Job's fortunes are restored twofold. So what can we make of this so-called happy ending of the book of Job? First, the fact that God did restore the fortune of Job does not imply God is meeting some obligation to restore Job's fortunes. At the surface level, you could fall back and see this as an application of the theology of retribution and reward, the one that this whole book to this point has been expounding against. Still, there is a happy ending for Job. Job gets everything back. Could this be leading us back to the old ways, the old theology of rewarding Job for being sinless? The problem is that interpretation doesn't really work. It doesn't really hold water. Getting a new family to replace the old one? Anyone who has lost a family member, a child, a spouse, for example, knows perfectly well that a new spouse or child never replaces the one lost. They can be loved deeply, but the new family member does not erase the memories of what came before. Second, it's important to note that the logic would tell us that the passing of time was needed for the restoration to be complete. While Job's wealth, family, and health were taken away almost in an instant, it's also important to note that in any real sense, the addition of 10 children would take some time, maybe at least 10 years or more if we follow the normal course of things. We misread the epilogue if we see it as the immediate restoration of Job's prior situation. What we do know is Job chooses to go on with life. What we do know is God chooses to grant him the gift of abundance. It is God's choice. God is under no obligation. One of the unfortunate outcomes of the epilogue, when combined with the rest of this text, is to imply to those who suffer, we think unjustly, often inexplicably, that they should not give voice to their rage and despair about perceived silence of God, not be sharing their protest with God. Actually, Job invites believers to a different behavior. Job invites all to voice their protest against any theology that suggests God employs or endorses innocent suffering. Job invites a theology that includes a compassionate God, a theology that does not require or does not dash the happy ending of Job, but the ending invites those who suffer to explore what they have learned of God, even while sitting in the ash heap, no matter how they got there. Furthermore, this epilogue exhibits the example of Job living again after unspeakable pain, a kind of resurrection. This model of life moving on after tragedy is reflected in the verse added at the very end. It was actually added when the Septuagint, that's the early Greek translation, was created. It added, and Job died old and full of days. Perhaps this is a more appropriate place to leave the story of Job, with Job having waited for the final world to come. This complex work, the book of Job, plumbs the depths of despair and comes out on the other side into life again. In this moment, it testifies not only to the reality of inexplicable suffering, but also to the possibility of new life. Life lived out in relationship with God. A God beyond our human comprehension. A God known through faith. We find no other biblical text addresses the question of divine justice, often put in simple terms of why bad things happen to good people, in such a confrontational and artistic way as Job. It confirms for us we live in an amazing world that is not designed by God to prevent our suffering. Every generation and every individual has known undeserved suffering and can relate to this story of Job. Job uniquely addresses this conundrum of suffering, not just with patience. This story of this righteous suffering seems to be a direct rebuttal of the traditional idea of you reap what you sow, found in many other biblical texts. This may be frustrating to some and liberating to many others. Although we have spent 4 weeks with it, the book still refuses to offer a direct human-level answer to this issue of human suffering and divine justice. It does not clearly debunk a simplistic understanding of reward and retribution, that understanding of God's justice. It never gives a clear answer to the question. What it has done is invite us to consider Job's perspective and our perspective versus God's perspective to gain wisdom and understanding. Well, in King James type language, in deference to our visitor, thus endeth our 4-week journey through the book of Job. The book considered by most scholars to be the finest wisdom text of the Jewish and Christian canons. Please remember, faith, like our understanding of God, our theology, is not a destination, not a task to be completed. It is a journey. I hope you have enjoyed our journey together through the book of Job. Amen.